Ready? Okay. Welcome. This is an 8 o'clock in the morning review that's taking place midday because we've been once again uh, beaten down by the forces of inclemency, a theological term with which you're getting a great deal of familiarity this year. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the principles of enlightenment that I introduced to you the other day. First and foremost, I wanted to say that it had to do with the introduction of new systems of classification. That this is characterized by the British Museum and lots of ways of organizing knowledge. Subset of that would be the Encyclopedia, Linnaeus system of plant organization, the map of John Smith, so forth and so on. It's different ways of classifying. And those different ways of classifying emerge by and large from the systematic development of observational rationality. So new systems of classification that follow upon observational rationality. So you could actually say, okay, you get the rise of observational rationality. It's not long before it forces new systems of classification. And when you start to do that, you begin to realize that those systems of classification stand in some tension, point 3, with received traditions of classification, largely systems that were anchored in the Bible. So you have two systems, and it's not that one replaces the other. It's that they stand in tension and create and destabilize each other. So what you have is what Max Weber called disenchantment. This is the emergence of disenchantment. You're not willing to let go of the old. You're trying to take hold of the new, but each of them tends to destabilize or unsettle us. There's no nice naivete, no first naivete, as Paul Ricoeur called it, in which you just live innocently, as it were, into the world. Now, examples of this, namely that attempt to hold together two different systems of thinking, are found first in Spinoza, who is very concerned to give us a way of interpreting biblical literature, namely scripture, and he's a Jew. So his agenda is religious toleration, so that the interpretation of scripture is not held captive to the creeds of the churches or the catechisms of which people were obliged to subscribe. So he says, look, it's not something external, but it's really a matter of the Bible is its own source of interpretation, and by that he meant specifically philologically. So the system he's going to use is the way in which language functions, and then a measure of generosity, that there is always the moral teaching of love God and love your neighbor. And he'll come back to that again and again and again. But the exact interpretation of Scripture is done in a way that is consistent with the new system of observational rationality. After all, he says it's like interpreting nature, but it's done with language. And it holds on to a way of interpreting received religious tradition. Later in the game, a man by the name of Reimarus, who's a biblical scholar, writes in secret a series of fragments which eventually come into the possession of Lessing, who published them after Reimarus' death. These were so threatening that had they been published in Reimarus' lifetime, he would probably have been put to death. Certainly would have been imprisoned, because they challenge the integrity of the reports in Scripture of miracle, and it even raises questions about whether what Jesus was saying was the same thing that his disciples were saying. Reimarus began to have the suspicion that the disciples had sort of rewritten the story to correct for the fact that the kingdom that Jesus said was breaking in didn't break in. And so they began to massage the story to make sense of the fact that what Jesus said didn't happen, or to make a corrective to what he said. Lessing um, wrote his own essays on theology, and encouraged people to be clear that there were distinctions between what a person might have said in the presence of Jesus about Jesus' life and what it means to respond to a report years later that this must have been what Jesus said. So he said, in the first sense, there's no question that you would respond empirically to what you saw, but merely getting a report of it doesn't work. So what he says, in a little event in history, an accident of history, is not the basis for a universal truth of reason. This isn't referred to as Lessing's ugly diction. We'll return to it when we get to Kierkegaard. It's very, very important that people want to take a particular event, namely the Christ event, and then make universal claims on the basis of the Christ event. But the question is, what would that look like? And here, notice Lessing is trying to hold on. He says, look, I believe, but what I believe is that these are reports of people who experience things in ways that I don't. And so I don't dispute their report. I simply say, for me, it's a report. It's not firsthand experience. So he's already appealing to a system of experience to sort out what kinds of claims we can accept and what kinds of claims we can't accept. Now, another way of going about this, as I mentioned in the lecture the other day, was Cherbury. And Lord Herbert of Cherbury put together a system of common notions, having based his experience on a great deal of observation of other religious traditions in the course of his travels. So I identified 10 common notions, and I said to you, well, now notice that the one in which all religions give evidence is revelation, and that revelation is the wellspring from which the other notions come. So it's a midpoint holding together received religious tradition on the one hand and empirical rational observation on the other. So these are appeals to new systems of classification, and they stand in some contrast with what happened after the 30 Years' War. After the 30 Years' War, rational orthodoxy sets in, and the purpose of that is to create a unified perspective. And so, right orthodoxy literally means right belief. Orthodontist, the guy that straightens out your teeth, or the woman. The fact is, what you get is an alignment, and an enforced alignment. And so you've got that as the backdrop over against which the pietists come in and say, wait a minute, it's not about forced enlightenment. It's about a matter of the heart, of reading together and learning together and working together and being sensitive to the needs of others together. It's not about doctrine. It's about living a Christian life. And so that, for them, by the way, the pietists were hugely interested in and gave a great deal of emphasis to education. Second, they gave a great deal of emphasis to charitable institutions, hospitals, orphanages, and the like. So there was a social activist side of this. So you were trying to live in the world, live with these Christian principles, but out of one's own experience. So this was over against the extremes of right belief. Now it was pious living. And then when we get to the Enlightenment, that gets challenged by saying, well, it's not just a matter of pious living. It's also living in a world in which the new kind of observational rationality stands in tension with this received pious intent to live well. And those two ways of thinking upend each other, destabilize one another, which gives rise to a further need for new systems of classification to hold it together. But at this point, the attempt is still predominantly to hold these two different ways of thinking, the new one based on observational rationality, the old based largely on scriptural interpretation, together so that one could have a unified life and not surrender religion. There were, of course, those who wanted to reject religion altogether, but they did not constitute a majority. So that's really the framework from which you can work on your papers this week. Pay attention to the different kinds of strategy in systems of classification that are used for each of the thinkers to make the case that they're making about what counts as Christian life. Thank you.